forever to find the police.
Tests are underway to determine if a serial killer is on the loose in Centurion, Pretoria.
The dead won't bother you. It's the living you gotta worry about.
In a country marked by the harsh reality of 84 daily murders, these are the stories that echo through the reality of our lives in South Africa. Hello, it's Paul Llewellyn, and here we are live on YouTube. This is exciting. Please hit the like button, hit subscribe if you haven't already. Joining me, as always, my partner in crime, Gerard Labiskachny. Hello, Gerard. How are you?
Hi, Paul. Hello, everybody else.
So, of course, Gerard is our former law enforcement officer, current head of LNS Threat Management, helmed the investigative psychology section of the South African Police Service from 2001 to 2016, worked on over 300 serial murder and rape cases, an internationally recognized and renowned expert in forensic psychology, and he is simply known as our profiler. Here we are, Gerard, live on the YouTube. Do not swear. Wait. You see, we're going to have some technical issues, I'm sure, as we go. Let me unmute you. Okay, now you're unmuted. Sorry, Gerard. Okay, there we go. Our first technical issue out of the way. Hopefully it'll be the last. How's it going, Gerard?
It is going pretty well, Paul. Thanks.
Okay, good. So how's life in the world of threat management?
Life in the world of threat management is going well. We had a conference last week in Sandton for 2 days. We had some really great international and local speakers, basically talking about anything from mass violence incidents. We had the Secret Service from the United States speaking about that, to stalking, to even someone presenting on serial murder. The sentencing of Rosemary Glover, which I think is something we've mentioned on our channels before, on our podcast, that policewoman serial murderer. So yeah, and then we had some nice workshops on the Wednesday and Thursday and Friday. So that was my week last week. Okay.
All right. Well, we're going to do so much. We're going to do a couple of things tonight. I mean, first of all, we're just kind of, like I say, dipping our toes into the water of this doing live podcast thing. Typically we do pre-records and we get to edit out all the fluffs in between. This one, we're just going to go for it and see what happens. We'll be talking about a specific case as well. We're going to be talking about the story of South Africa's youngest ever serial killer, who was also a female. So South Africa's youngest female serial killer, from the town of Kempdorp. So we'll be diving into that one a little bit. Please do hit like and subscribe on the channel. Obviously, the plan from here on out is that we'll be doing this every Tuesday night from 8 to 9. We'll be going live. I think the motivation for the live is that we get to engage with the audience, and folks can join in the chat, post questions, and we can address some of that stuff live as we go. And we can have a bit more of a rounded conversation about the cases, incorporating some of that our viewer feedback as we go through the show. So please do join in the chat, say hello. It'll be nice to know that you're out there, and hit like and subscribe. We'll be doing this, like I say, every Tuesday. And then at 9 o'clock, straight after this, we're going to be premiering a whole episode of a true crime show that we call True Crime Room, hosted by a Canadian friend of ours by the name of Derek Riedler, who and you'll be able to see that straight after our chat here. We're going to try and fill the next hour talking about crime and the case of Jan Kempdorp and a couple of other things. The episode tonight of True Crime Room that Derek will be discussing will be the case of Anisha and Joey van Niekerk. So maybe we can just touch on that towards the end of the hour, as a way of introduction to that, which will premiere at 9 p.m. So that's that. Okay, so Gerard, the state of the nation. How's it going? How's it going in SA? What's the goss from your former law enforcement officers, officer friends, and what have you? How are we doing? What are your thoughts?
I don't think we've improved much, since we've had our elections and lots of promises were made. As you know, I think in the Northwest Province, they're trying to get some illegal miners out from underneath the the ground in the illegal mines. That's sort of going with some kind of reasonable success. But yeah, I mean, I'm still not sure if I'm hearing the right kind of words that would make me think that we're going to really get on top of the crime stats. That's yeah. So not the best of news.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well,
I mean, I think not much has changed, I think, is the bottom line. I mean, there's not improvement, possibly, you know, just a continuation of the trends over the last 4 or 5 years where things are just not great. A lot of brain drain still out of the police service, I would imagine. But anyway, that's that. Let's not hop on the let's not hop on the state of the nation. I'd like to get into talking about some cases and what have you. Anything else I needed to do? Admin? No. All right, so we're going to talk tonight about the case of South Africa's youngest serial killer. It's a case that took place in a little town in the Northern Cape called Kempdorp. Gerard, first of all, let's set the scene a little bit for those. I mean, we've discussed this lots of times on the audio version of the podcast. Let's open up with a kind of a general discussion on serial killers in South Africa. What is the typical serial killer scenario profile in South Africa that we look at? And then we'll work our way towards this case, which is really a very rare and unusual case.
Yeah, so in South Africa, based on the research that we did a couple of years ago when I was still in the police, your average age of a serial murderer when we know that they've committed their first crime is 29 years old. Obviously, in line with our population stats, the average serial murderer in South Africa is a black male. So 29 years old at the time of their first known murder, black male, and the typical scenario is really them luring someone away with the offer of employment, and through that process luring them to a deserted area that they've checked out beforehand, and then they typically would then rape, then strangle them to death. So that's just standard stuff. Of course, we've had people who are younger, we have people who are older, we have people who use different con stories or different stories to get a hold of their victims, but that's kind of the standard one in South Africa, using some kind of story to lure your victim away. So female serial murderers, really, to be honest with you, we've probably had less than a handful, literally. People often speak about Daisy DeMelker as perhaps our first known serial murderess. But technically speaking, she was only convicted of one murder, that of her son, if I recall correctly. So, we believe that she murdered a few of her husbands, again, usually for an insurance payout. But that's, if you want to base it on true convictions, then we couldn't really refer to Daisy DeMelker as a serial murderess. A great book written by Ted Buerter, who sort of went and documented it, went into the archives of newspapers from the times, and really wrote a really good documentary style book about that case, but also weaving into it what was happening in that local environment in Johannesburg in those early 1900s. So the next person that we could perhaps call as a female serial murderess would have been someone like Charmaine Phillips, her and her boyfriend Peter Grindling in their sort of early mid-80s. So they went on this from Durban, Melmoth, Secunda, and really just kind of robbing and killing random guys that they would pick up in a bar or hitchhiking, stealing whatever money that they had on their possession. So that's kind of really it when we talk about your female serial murderers, until we start to get to someone like Rosemary Ndlovu from a couple of years ago. I think she was convicted last year or the year before in the High Court. And she was a serving member of the South African police at Tembisa police station, and ended up killing numerous, family members, etc., either by getting a hitman to take them out, or I think she physically killed one or two of the people herself. And essentially that was driven by financial insurance policies that she'd taken out on these people. And she was quite dramatic. If you ever watch footage of her in court, she kind of very much played up to the audience, would dress very nicely each day, would kind of pose for the cameras. So she was quite an interesting character. And interestingly enough, we have another case right now, also with another member of the South African Police Services, also a female cop, who's done exactly the same thing, killing people after taking out insurance policies. So that seems in South Africa that the most frequent thing is going to be, if it is rarely a female, it's going to very often be sort of insurance motivated, which is not your standard serial murder, but it's still meets the definition criteria of serial murder.
Yeah. So big differences when it comes to kind of motivations and what have you. Let's talk about youngsters. I mean, like your typical age. What is your typical age group that people would kind of, start to kill people?
Yeah, so like I said, from the research we did, the average starting age was 29 years when their first murder occurred.
Okay.
Now, the youngest I'd ever worked on before, well, this case I think was just after I left the police. My colleague Bron Stollers worked on it. But the youngest one I ever worked on was from Vredendal, which is in sort of up the west coast, sort of a wine farming community.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a 15-year-old boy who raped and murdered someone. He was caught not long thereafter. He was sentenced of a sorts, because he was a minor, to one of these sort of reform school, for lack of a better word. And they get to go home on holidays. So fast forward, I think just before his 18th birthday, he's at home for the holidays and he rapes and murders someone else. And then, if I recall correctly, just after he turned 18, in other words, a few weeks later, still on holiday, he then raped and murdered, or tried to rape and murder, another person. So that was the earliest one that I've had. And that was 15 years old when that person started, and sort of 18 when they were finally, caught for their second and third incidences.
Yeah. So, I mean, the context that you've kind of provided there really does shine a big spotlight on just how different this particular case then is that we're going to discuss, how unique and how rare it is. I mean, this is a 12-year-old girl. We're not able to refer to her name for legal reasons, obviously, because she was a minor at the time of the incidents. Currently, she is back out in the world, so she's served out her sentence, and she is back in the public, which we can discuss as well, some of the kind of implications of that. But Gerard, just kind of set the scene, and let's talk about Jan Kempdorp first, where it took place up in the Northern Cape. Give us a little bit of a sense of that place.
Yeah, I mean, it's a tiny sort of Northern Cape town. Not much going on around it. I don't think there's lots of great career prospects for people who grew up in those kind of communities, unless you're going to be working on a farm somewhere, which I think you get a lot of that generational stuff, possibly some people working on the mines. But it's really a small little town with really not much happening, to be honest with you.
Okay, and then so let's jump into it. What happened? I mean, where can we start on the story of this case?
So I mean, this little girl, I think when she comes to the police's attention, she was 13 years old at the time. But we know, obviously you start your investigation with one case, and then often you find about other cases that might occurred before, etc. So you don't always start off with the first case that occurred. And that's kind of what happened here. We had essentially what happened, it was October 2000, in October 2013, or when it was January, yeah. And she was essentially walking with another little friend of hers, a little 4-year-old girl, Rafilwe, sort of tagged along. And essentially at one point they got to a little sort of dam, irrigation dam. And long story short, she intentionally pushed the little child into the dam and basically let the child drown. And that's really when we have the first incident. And that was a 4-year-old little girl. And when she was asked afterwards why, she said, no, she just hated her, that's why. And, what did she do after she pushed the child into the water? Well, she just sat and watched. So clearly, knowing what she was doing, knowing what the outcome was going to be, didn't really have much emotions, and all she really feared was really just getting caught.
How was this particular incident received by the police? Was it reported to the police? What happened when the case came to light?
Oh, yeah, I'm not quite sure initially how this came to light, whether they called a farmer over and basically told them they'd found a body, if I recall correctly, and the cops, the farmer obviously then would have called would have called the police.
Okay, but I mean, at this stage, they didn't put this incident together with anything else. What is the next kind of big step in the case?
Yeah, well, I mean, in terms of how things unfolded, I mean, at one point they eventually do pick her up and start to interview her, and she starts to essentially tell them what she did. She mentioned that earlier in that year, she pushed another 11-year-old boy into the dam, but it was not very deep, so that person didn't survive. So, we might not have had more than one murder, but we have, a young kid who was trying to commit another murder or had tried to commit another murder. So in the eyes of the law, you would have been charged with attempted murder. So attempted murder means your plan was to actually kill this person. So that's why sometimes when people say, well, you've got only one successful murder and one attempted murder, or even two attempted murders, should we then regard this person as a serial murderer? And to my answer is yes, because the definition of an attempted means you were trying to actually, in this case, kill someone. So attempted murder means you were trying to kill them, and perhaps just by good luck or good medical intervention or the act of God, the person didn't die, but your plan had been to kill the person. Otherwise, it just would have been an assault or assault GBH, kind of case. So essentially, we have an earlier case where she tries to kill someone, a later case where she kills a 4-year-old little girl and just really just watches her while this happens. So I definitely think that that should be treated then as a murder series from my point of view. And of course, she did a few other things to kids, which we can also get into.
What is I mean, children are rowdy, they're like pushing and shoving and wrestling games and that kind of thing. I mean, what could possibly lead somebody of this age to, kind of these levels of violence kind of straight out of the gate?
Yeah, I mean, look, this is exceptionally rare. I mean, little kids don't commit this kind of intended violence. You might find little kids do things and don't necessarily understand the consequences. And of course, once whatever happened has happened, they then realize what they've done, and they can be very remorseful. But this is something different. This little child really didn't express any remorse. Even, after these cases were finalized, towards the investigating officer who spent a lot of time with this little girl, just never really seemed to realize how serious what she did was. And then it's a very young age to start throwing around words like psychopath, etc. But, this is not a good start. This is not, like I said, experimenting out of ignorance. It's like some kids, hurt animals, but then when the animal cries, or whatever, screams or makes a noise, they realize what they've done, and they don't do that thing again. But this wasn't. I mean, this child, I'm just looking at my notes here, in total, she pushed 3 kids into the dam. One of them who died, 2 of them thankfully survived over a space of 2012, then January 2013, and later in 2013. So that's not a great prognosis. We'll have to see. 2013, she's now 24 years old. If I'm not mistaken, yeah, she was born in 2000. Very curious to see what she was like. She was first in sort of a children's protected environment, and I think if I recall later, when she turned 18, she went for sentencing. So be curious to know how her behavior was like over these past, 11 years while she was in some form of custody. Did she abide by the rules? Did she do well at school? That she was getting. How much has changed? Or do we really still have someone who just doesn't have that emotionness that we kind of expect everybody to have to some kind of degree?
What kind of would she have been put through any kinds of programs once incarcerated? Would she be working with psychologists? Being that she's so young.
Well, I'd like to think so. I'm not too sure exactly where she was eventually sent, but I would imagine that these youth facilities would have psychologists that are seeing most of these kids, some kind of a program. But it's kind of, it's such a rare thing. What do we do for this child? I mean, there's not like you can pull off a serial murder treatment manual off the side of the shelf and know what to do. So I think any psychologist, no matter how good you are, you'd be kind of sitting there, how do I fix this? And of course, the question is, can it actually be fixed? So yes, I would be very surprised if she didn't have any psychological intervention in these, for 11 years that she was in prison. Can I guarantee it? Well, you know what? Nowadays, I can't guarantee anything that correctional services should be doing.
The first step towards any kind of treatment would be identifying kind of what the issue is. Can you diagnose somebody who's 12, 13 years old as a psychopath? Are they too early in their kind of development for that?
We'd usually say it's too early because, people's personality is still forming. And kids can do things that are quite extreme in these young teenage years as their brains are developing and their emotions developing and hormones are running through them. That isn't necessarily a blueprint of how they're going to be for the rest of their life. So that's why we really want to be careful about making a personality diagnosis of any kind. So typically you'd want to wait at least until they're 18. And even then you want to have very clear history, that supports that. But usually before that date, it will be a very kind of tentative diagnosis. You can get something called conduct disorder, which is kind of like a junior psychopath, if you want to call it that, which you can make that finding when they're younger. It wouldn't yet be a personality disorder, but it would be a type of diagnosis. You can, of course, make other diagnoses like depression and psychosis and PTSD, the standard things. But when it comes to personality, you really want to rather just give this person time to settle down. Because people can really go off the rails when they're 13, 14, 15, but they can kind of get very much back onto those rails as they just sort of grow out of it. But this is very serious stuff. And, when we talk about risk for reoffending, when it comes to violent crime and sexual crime, typically when people are doing naughty things at a young age, we kind of say, well, if we catch it, we can fix it. And I'm sure that's for like the general naughtiness that you might find, bad behavior, bunking school, smoking cigarettes, shoplifting. But when it comes to violent crime and sex crime, the earlier you start, the worse the prognosis is. And sometimes there's a double-edged sword because people think, oh, well, early starting with violence or sexual crime, this is now this person is a hopeless case, can also mean that people don't put any effort into it. So we have to be careful that we don't write off people. But the research shows us that the earlier you're starting with violent crime and sexual crime, typically the prognosis is going to be quite bad for that kind of behavior to continue throughout adolescence and into adulthood.
Is there okay, no, let me not ask that question. Okay, so we've talked about the kind of prognosis being not good. I'd imagine because these are such rare cases, there's not a handbook for how to deal with this kind of case. It's if you were looking to come up with a means of treating this young girl, would you look at other cases? Would you look to kind of, in other parts of the world perhaps, or?
Yeah, I mean, it would be worth it. I mean, I don't know of any other cases like this in South Africa, so that's how rare it is. So yes, so one would turn to hopefully to research that you try and look up these cases, similar things, what happened, what the prognosis was. You'd also want to speak to the family, mother, father, if they're available, or the other kids, troublesome or not. Is this a pattern of behavior that, the parents or one of the parents might have exhibited also? So you'd kind of want to explore all of that to hopefully give you a better idea of how we're going to sort of proceed forward.
Yeah.
But if you don't really have any empathy for other people, that's the difficult thing to learn. You've never really had it. And we have, besides these 3 cases I mentioned, when one was drowned at the dam and 2 other kids on separate occasions were pushed into the dam water but survived. We also have it in October of that same year, 2013, where he takes a little girl with her out to go plant some baroch and essentially uses a stick to rape the child. That would have been incredibly painful. In fact, part of the stick broke off inside of her, and she was bleeding. And then she admits that she did the same thing before with the 3-year-old child. So you have, 3 times, one murder, 2 attempted murders, and 2 rapes. So you essentially have serial rape for sure. You've met the two minimum criteria. And as I said, she should be looked at and viewed from a risk point of view as a serial murderer because of those 1 successful and 2 attempted. So, you really do need to have some level of empathy already to make any therapy work. Because if you really don't feel like what you did really was wrong, you don't feel bad about it, then what's your motivation to change? That's really why something like a psychopath diagnosis is very damning for your prognosis for the future, for your risk. Because without that, that's kind of like feeling bad about something or worrying about something or the consequences is really what makes us stay on this straight and narrow. I don't want to feel bad because I don't want to do that again because I'll feel bad, or I don't want to do this because I will go to jail, and that's not something that I want to happen. But if those kind of driving forces aren't there, then you unfortunately, what's going to motivate this person to try and change instead of just sitting there being bored, possibly going through the motions just to get through whatever program that they have to go through.
Is there a system in place to monitor these types of people once they are released back into public? Is there
So if you get released on parole, then yes, parole, you can impose conditions. That's why parole is very important. Because you can say that you will report twice a week to the police station. You will go for these community counseling sessions. You will go for community service. So you can impose whatever conditions, obviously within reason, that the person has to abide by while they're on parole. If the person just reaches the end of their sentence, let's say somebody was very bad, didn't get parole because they were always misbehaving. Once you get to your 10-year sentence, you just walk right out the gates and can't even ask you where you're going. So and that's not a great scenario because you're setting someone up to fail. So parole actually is really important because we can release you out into the community. Someone has to agree to look after you. You have to abide by certain conditions, and if you can't, you will get pulled back into the prison. So it allows us to have this monitoring period in which we can pull the person back in if things don't work well. That's why parole is very important. A lot of people kind of fight against it. Now, I do think we shouldn't get to the point where we're giving parole halfway through your sentence. For me, that's a joke. I think if you have a 15-year sentence, maybe 2 or 3 years prior to your final release date, you should be starting to be considered for parole. But I think halfway through your sentence really kind of makes it feel like, and correctional services will try to give you parole at that point in time. I think sometimes parole boards think that you're supposed to be released when you reach your minimum detention period, and only if you've done really bad stuff should you be kept longer. And I think that also needs to be tweaked. I mean, this parole system is just, in general, quite a joke.
Yeah. I recommend that folks go back and listen to some of the previous episodes that we've done where we've really deep dived into the parole system. Because, we're at an interesting time. We had a whole lot of serial killers being caught 25, 30 years ago. And all of those maximum sentences are coming up. And, there are some interesting people, no doubt, being released back into the public that, we're largely not aware of. The news is so busy down south that these things get kind of lost a little bit, don't they? I would just like to say that it's exciting. Thanks, everyone. If you're jumping onto the live stream, this is me and Gerard doing Profiler live for the first time. This is kind of our test case, our test episode. We didn't do much shouting about the fact that we were going to do this, just because we want to have the space for an hour to be able to mess up a little bit, and who knows what technical glitches might have been sneaking into the program. But so far so good. Really nice to be also able to engage with you guys. I see we've been starting to get some messages in. Shall we take a question? We've never taken a question before. We actually have a question from Julian. I think it's Julian Sota. Let's pop it up there. So Julian's asking, what are some common misconceptions about profiling?
Sure. I think what you know about profiling is primarily what you've seen on TV shows, which are not documentary style, but more just entertainment shows. It really gives you this idea that your profilers are the investigator of the case. They're out there on crime scenes. They're interviewing suspects. And the reality is the majority of profilers out there are not doing all of that. Even FBI profilers, they're typically not at the crime scene because they're only invited into the case, a while afterwards. Maybe if it's a series that they're helping with and there's a new body that comes up, they might maybe if they're in the right time at the right place. So the idea that this profiler is the lead of the investigation and the person who's making all the decisions and interviewing all the suspects isn't really like that. Now, ironically, the place where it was the closest like that is actually in South Africa, in my old unit, where there were some instances where I was in charge of the task team, like the Quarry Murder series, which we've spoken about, and the one stalker case, which I was literally the investigating officer. But typically you were joining an investigation. And even with the FBI, their profilers all sat originally in Quantico, and then now it's a little bit further down the road from Quantico. And like I said, they don't have profilers, FBI profilers scattered around America. You all sit centralized just near Quantico. So you only get involved in a case when the local police department invites you in. It's not like on TV, you said the feds are here to take over. If it's a murder series or any other case, unless it's across state boundaries, you have to be invited in, which usually means you're arriving there after the fact and after the crime scene. And like I said, unless you happen to be helping them at the time with an active murder investigation, series investigation, and you're on site when another body is found, then you would go to that crime scene. So a lot of that stuff is not really happening in real life. And also, I think what's a misperception that people have is that profilers are all psychologists. In fact, it's almost a rarity that you get a profiler who's a psychologist, at least a proper professional one. There are a lot of people out there calling themselves profilers who aren't really profilers. And again, the situation in South Africa where it actually is like that, because I was a profiler, Mickey Pistorius was a psychologist, I was a psychologist. But in general, your profilers in the professional profiling community are actually investigators who have subsequently obtained profiling training. So that's another misconception, that you're all psychologists that are out there. I think that's the main ones that people really get wrong.
In America, if you were to be a profiler if you were invited to be a profiler on a case, in a kind of a local level, they could invite people from a professional profiler from the community, if you like. You know what I mean? Like they don't just use the FBI guys if they want to call in a profiler. They would typically have like service providers that they call into a case. Is that right? And in South Africa, to work on a case, you need to be a cop. Simple as that.
Yeah. So can you? It also dependent on how your police is set up. So in South Africa, we just have the South African Police Service. So if it's a stolen cell phone, South African Police Service investigates that. If it's a terrorism case, the South African Police Service investigates that. So we only have effectively one police service that does investigations into crime. And for that, we had one profiling unit, the investigative psychology section. But now you look at something like the United States, it has 17,000 law enforcement agencies, and they're all independent of each other. So each little police department is its own law enforcement agency. It hires its own police members. It has its own uniform, its own policies, its own procedures, and its own jurisdiction where it can operate. And outside of that jurisdiction, you're no longer a cop. So it's literally, for those of us in South Africa, it would be as if Sandton Police Station is an independent police service. And then you might have Honeydew, and that'll be its own independent police service. So it's very fragmented, which means that those independent law enforcement agencies can do pretty much whatever they want because they're not beholden to anybody. And then, of course, you've got the state police, state troopers is often a term used, and of course your federal stuff like your FBI, DEA, etc. So that means that there's a lot of scope for those local agencies to use whoever they want. And maybe you find that in a community, at a university, there's a guy who puts himself out there as a profiler and he's got some kind of relationship with that local police department, they might use that person. It's not a regulated industry. So it's unlike, for example, psychology in South Africa, where there are laws that determine who can call themselves a psychologist. It's a protected title. You can go to jail if you're pretending to be a psychologist and you're not really one. So it's not really as it's not regulated. So there's nothing to stop anybody from calling themselves a profile. I mean, I know people here in South Africa who on LinkedIn refer to themselves as offender profilers, and I know them and I know their backgrounds, and honestly, I would really not call them profilers, but there's no law that says they're not allowed to call themselves profilers.
What would you recommend to folks out there as the best route to being somebody that you would consider to becoming someone that you would consider to be a qualified profiler?
Well, currently in South Africa, the only place you can really get that level of training would be in the investigative psychology section. And that has people that are experienced detectives in it. It has some psychologists in it. And in more recent years, they've also had criminologists. So it's there that you would probably be the closest to learning how to actually become a profiler. Because if you look at sort of the one guideline that exists, the International Criminal Investigative Analysis Fellowship, the ICIAF, which was essentially originally people who had been through the FBI training. And once the FBI stopped training non-FBI people, the ICIAF was formed like as an association for alumni. But also people realizing that in our agency, how are we going to get our people trained now that the FBI isn't training people? And they basically reformulated that curriculum that the FBI was following. And basically, if you are in law enforcement and you have someone who's prepared to supervise you who is a ICIF profiler, you can then sort of be mentored. But there is a set curriculum of things you need to undergo. And a lot of those things are things you're probably only going to be able to get training in if you are actually in law enforcement. So some of the examples would be things like, homicide investigators course, bloodstain pattern analyst course, forensic pathology training, crime scene ballistics training, arson and fire profiling training. So a whole, like 20 different courses that you have to do as part of that ICF curriculum, and also would include experiential visits to 3 different agencies, of which one would have been the FBI. So that's kind of the standard and benchmark that the ICIF has. So that's very difficult to get that level of exposure and training in the private world.
Okay. All right, great. Well, thank you, Julian, for your question. I hope we shed some light. There's so much to talk about in this. The one question I had was, what is the current state of the investigative psychology unit at SAPS? What's kind of going down there currently? I'm sure you've still got friends outside.
So it still exists. I think at the head office unit, because in my days when I started, it was just 3 of us. When I joined in 2001, I was the only psychologist, and Colonel Myberg was still there till today. And at the time back then it was Captain Evans. Now, even before I left, we had decentralized to open up branches in each of the 9 provinces, which might have had 1 or 2 people, 2 or 3 people at the most. Some of the provinces had another psychologist. I think at the moment, we just had recently Colonel Clark, who had been the psychologist. I think she joined about a year after I left, probably about 2017. She's recently resigned from the police. I think there's 1 other psychologist now in the unit, and spanned across any of the provincial units also. So there's still a fairly strong head office component, but I don't know how strong some of the provincial units are. And as I said, probably I think there's just 1 psychologist left. One of the big problems that after I left, not because I left, but after I left, is that they really didn't have a lot more training. There's been hardly any training for people since I've left. So the psychologists would join, and you're not trained to do this work during your normal clinical psychology training or counseling psychology training. So it's a job that you arrive with some benefits, that you're a psychologist, of course, but you still have to be trained. And that didn't really happen after I left. Even with the psychologist joining, there wasn't really any of the sort of training that we used to have when I was there. So the unit still exists. Elmarie Myberg, Captain Myberg, is still there. She's one of the founder members of the unit. But she's also getting close to the point where she could consider retiring. I think that next year she could consider early retirement. A couple of the older guys have retired. Colonel DeLonge, that are featured on some of our episodes on Profiler podcast, has retired early about 2 years ago. Aubrey Sechwalea, very experienced sexual offences investigator, retired. So a lot of the guys that had and ladies that had a lot of experience in the unit are actually retiring. And the difficulty, once you lose that backbone of core experienced people who will help mentor the new crowd, etc., and you're not bringing in further training, it's difficult to see, because you're basically left starting from scratch and hoping you reinvent the wheel in the right shape, which that's not great.
Yeah, you kind of have to go back and start from scratch to a large degree, Ben. And it's not like they're inviting the likes of yourself back in to kind of help to make sure that the next class that's coming through are as qualified and capable as your class has been.
In fact, I've never been asked to come and give training to anybody since I left.
Yeah,
I'd extended the offer, but I've never been asked to come and give training workshops, to work with the new psychologists or some of the new people, to give some mentoring, to anyway sort of help them develop their skills. And unfortunately, that's the SA Police's attitude that I've seen in many instances, that if someone resigns, in other words, you leave before retirement, it's kind of like you get put on essentially like a bit of a shit list, in a way, if I can use that word. You left us, so we want nothing to do with you. Definitely, we're not going to ever pay you to do something for us when you used to work for us. I mean, that's like even a huger no-no. But my offer for training was not one where I expected to be paid. So SAPS kind of shoots itself in the foot in that way, that people who resign, they kind of look down very natively at. But even people who reach retirement age, who might be prepared to help supervise people, to mentor people, they just don't ever make use of that resource. There's no mechanism officially whereby they could get those retired people who maybe want to donate 2 mornings a week to go through dockets, to help supervise dockets for new detectives, etc. That just doesn't happen. So SAPS does kind of shoot itself in the foot in that sense. It doesn't also have the concept of consultants. Let's get someone who's a 10 hours a month consultant, and that person will come in 5 hours on this day, and then 2 weeks later for 5 hours, and we'll just be there to help people discuss cases, inspect dockets, etc. They don't do that, and for whatever reasons that they don't do it. And they lose out on really leveraging, as I said, a lot of experienced people who might be quite prepared. Because I mean, retirement for a cop is often boring, because you've spent your whole life in a very high-paced job, and you think it's going to be great sitting at home doing nothing, but after the first 2 weeks you're bored as hell. So I think there would be people who would be willing to help it, or whether getting those people to come and give training on the detective training. Because at one point, that whole 6 months detective training course, which had multiple presenters, I think only one of them had ever actually been a detective. So you had people who were literally just teaching out of a book. We've got a thumbs up sign there. Hey. So someone who, and if you're going to just have people who have no experiential knowledge, you may as well just give people the manual and say, read it yourself, because you can't answer my questions. Oh, God forbid you answer what you think is the right answer, but you have no experience where that's coming from, and you teach people the wrong thing. Then rather do a video course that people just sit and stare at, because what would be the point of teaching if you have a psychologist, people having psychology lectures by someone who's not even a psychologist? It would seem so bizarre to us.
Remind us what has happened to SAP structurally to kind of hinder the way I understand it is you have SAPS as the law enforcement organization for the country, and then you have individual police stations with competent, capable cops in the police stations, but then you have these centralized units with really the specialist cops, where they kind of gathered together in Pretoria, the best violent crime cops, for example, all working together on solving a particular type of crime. And if you identify a series in a province, then that elite team is deployed from central to go and handle it. But that doesn't seem to necessarily, it's kind of the case, but also not the case. What is like structurally, what's the situation at the moment?
So this goes
And what
back
happened?
to 2006 when Sir Levy was the then head of the police. As many of us might know, he was later found guilty of corruption and sentenced to jail time. He, in his infinite wisdom, shut down our specialized units. That included the sexual offences units, the firearms units, serious and violent crime units, really ones that were dealing with the really high-profile, complex, impactful, violent crime cases. And essentially, those units were successful for a couple of reasons. Firstly, you could only get into one of those units if you were hand-selected, and you had to be a very good detective. So you cherry-picked the really good cops to join a serious and violent crime unit, for example, which was in the old days more your murder and robbery kind of unit. And secondly, that you had usually 3 standby groups, and each group would have a week of the month where they're on standby, and there might be 12 people in that standby group. And if there's a case that comes up, there's a murder that's part of your mandate, that whole standby group of, say, 13 people would go out to the crime scene. Today, I might be on rotation, so it's going to be my docket, but I have those other 11 people there to do whatever I need them to do. I might say to someone, you go make inquiries amongst those houses over there, and if there's some information, you go follow it up for me. And I'll stay here and make sure the crime scene is being done properly. You make sure those exhibits, those fingerprints are taken to the fingerprint records to see if we can ID someone. So you have this team of experienced people there to make sure the crime scene was properly done, but also there to follow up on immediate information. And it's kind of because of that you often had those units being very successful. But then, like I said, in 2006, Jackie Levy shut down the serious and violent crime unit. They shut down the sexual offences units. Those have thankfully been opened up since then. And it kind of became like up to each province how big major crimes are going to be dealt with. And this is exactly why we had what we had with the Oscar Pistorius case. Because when that happened, we didn't have these specialized units. That would have gone to Pretoria Serious and Violent Crime Unit and would have been dealt with far more efficiently from the start, instead of that initial, chaos that ensued until Mike van Aert, Captain van Aert, was eventually assigned the docket. Ironically, he was an ex-serious and violent crime detective, an ex-murder and robbery detective, so he was really, really good. And that was just one of the biggest problems. We don't even nowadays have homicide units. We have the worst, some of the worst murder rates in the world, but we leave our murders up to 2 or 3 detectives at each police station will be responsible for investigating any unnatural death. So that could be a car accident, that could be a suicide, that could be a guy who fell off the roof while he's cleaning his gutters, and of course, yes, a murder. Now we've got 3 guys in a station who will deal with any of those things, and today if it's my turn, I take this case. So it's not a group of detectives, it's one guy. And that person might be sharing his vehicle with those other 2 detectives that he works with. And he's got 30, 40 dockets. We're setting detectives up for failure, which is why I think our current murder solving rate is, 12% for murders that get solved. That's horrifying.
I'd like to see what the curve looks like over the last 20 years. I mean, it surely wasn't that in 2000.
I don't know what the exact figures was, but I can definitely say it was not down to 12%.
Yeah. And we're not seeing really kind of the system adapting to try to address these issues that have been created.
No, what we did see kind of around about 2008, 2009, 2010, a big improvement in the forensic side of things.
Okay.
But then also we've had now scandals with, General Pashlani, who at one point was from about 2009, 2010, was appointed as head of forensics. And actually things started to become very functional at forensics. There was a purchasing of lots of equipment, appointing of new people, good equipment, turnaround times being, people pushed to make sure that they're dealing with things quickly. Then he was made the acting national commissioner, which I didn't think was a bad idea because he was a very, very smart guy. But then, of course, out come some corruption allegations. And even until today, he's still awaiting trial for corruption cases against him, which, I don't know if they're ever going to be able to actually proceed to trial with that. So that was kind of a glimmer of hope, definitely in the forensics lab. And I think, unfortunately, since he left, things have just kind of crumbled and gone backwards in terms of the forensics laboratory. And it's such a complex thing. You can't just have the detective doing their job. You have to have the crime scene people doing their job properly. You have to have the forensics people doing their job properly. You have to have prosecutors doing their jobs properly. Otherwise, there's so many different moving parts in a proper investigation and prosecution that they all have to be working literally at 100%.
Yeah.
Because if you don't have 100%, you have something that could render an item of an exhibit inadmissible in court. And until you actually work on murder cases or any investigation, you realize the admin and the nitty-gritty paperwork that has to be done perfectly to actually get a successful conviction in court. So, and if all of those things aren't working properly, then we're not going to have success. And then sadly, even our prosecutors nowadays, I've sat in some courtrooms and I've been appalled at the shocking behavior of prosecutors who clearly were very incompetent. Now, you still get some very good ones, don't get me wrong. Mm-hmm. But I'm just worried about, are we creating this next generation? Do we have people there that can mentor these really motivated young people into being, good prosecutors? And I know some very experienced prosecutors who will say to me, I used to try and help juniors, but they would get very, almost see it like you're attacking them if you try to help them or correct them. As any junior person, you don't know everything. But it's almost as if it seemed like, don't you tell me what to do, older, more senior person. So they kind of realized, okay, well, I'm going to back off and it's not my problem then. And the results are, because of people's arrogance, who think they know everything just because they have a LLB degree, you get things not functioning well in the courtroom. And if that prosecutor doesn't bring it all together in the courtroom, you're not going to have success.
Well, we have lots of time to get into all of the kind of detail around all of these topics. As you know, we are live right now here on YouTube, and we'll be doing this every Tuesday from 8 to 9 p.m. And then at 9 o'clock, we'll be premiering for the next 12 weeks, I think, a new episode of a series called True Crime Room with Derek Riedler, our Canadian friend, and talking about local cases as well. So tonight, talking about the Joey and Anisha van Niekerk case. Also, thanks very much for joining in the chat. I mean, like I say, we kind of we've done this very much on the hush, so that a bit of a test hour to see that that we don't kind of fall into any major technical dilemmas or difficulties. But we've had some people joining along. Here we go. T. Breitenbach, this is awesome. I'm a big fan of Gerard. There you go, Gerard. Another one for the fan club. And then we were talking about the law students. We've got Melissa. As a fourth-year law student, the whole profile of you is really interesting, and getting in the mind of the killer, figuring out who they are without actually knowing them. And Gerard is certainly our expert at kind of giving us insights in how you would do that. So, Melissa, make sure that you tune in every Tuesday, and we'll be able to pick Gerard's immensely knowledgeable brain on all of these great subjects. Talking about the state of the police and some of the structural challenges, I guess one of the sad things is that as the system becomes more dysfunctional, then you get good cops that want to work in an efficient system get frustrated out of that system, don't they?
Yeah, I mean, various things. I mean, if there's a lot of corruption, you also then eventually just have to keep your head down and do your own job and navigate around that. But yeah, for sure, you get a lot of guys who leave, investigators who leave the police with those years of experience and training that they might have had, and go into the private sector working for banks, or, most big corporations now have their own in-house investigators. And who do you think those are? Those are mostly ex-cops that are sitting in those positions who, because they get paid a pittance. I mean, I was quite shocked the other day when I saw a Lieutenant Colonel's payslip. I honestly thought it was going to be at least double of what it was. This is people who've been in the cops for, 2 decades or more, and they're earning a salary that I think, and how do you survive on that? If you've got a family that's supporting your kids, we pay our police badly. And, in other parts of the world, developed parts, Europe, United States, being a cop is actually a pretty good salary. You really, by the time you retire, and remember, cops in America on average retire after 20 years of service, not when they hit a certain age. So if you joined when you were, say, 22, by 42, you're on full retirement with full pension. And you can either go to another, law enforcement agency and, start working again, and you're getting your pension in the background, or start a completely separate career. And partly because of that is they realize the psychological and physical toll it puts on your body being a cop. And that's why they sort of, 20 years is the limit, where they feel that any longer, and, you're putting too much of a toll on a person. And also a lot of places in the rest of the world, you have to have a degree before you can become a cop.
Yeah.
So it is really a well-educated position and a well-paying position. Sadly, in the United States, I think the average sentiment seems to have turned against law enforcement, that law enforcement are seen as the bad guys, and you hear these things like defund the police, etc. So they're really struggling to get people in certain states in the US to actually join the police, because they reckon, I'm not going to put up with all that harassment from the community, because the general sentiment is so negative towards the police these days. So it's better paid, has its own challenges, of course. And if we're paying people peanuts, a constable, I think if you're getting out like 3,000 Rand a month, that's a lot. So why are we surprised when there's corruption? Why are we surprised that people are motivated to put their best in it when you're getting paid literally peanuts?
Exactly. The police, we need the police to be better. And, I guess my last question on this subject, we strayed quite badly away from our discussion about Jan Kempdorp. We can just wrap that one up as well, I think. But, I guess the thing about the brain drain out of the police is that, like I say, it's kind of irreversible, isn't it? But like you were saying, if you lose that knowledge, and then you not only lose their ability within the police service, but you lose that passing on of knowledge, which is a shame. What can we do? What should we do as the public to start to turn the tide on these types of things? Obviously the electorate voted, and there's been a bit of a shift in the politics of the country, but don't know how much of a change that has really made. But, any thoughts, a first thought on what can we do?
I think, I don't know what the final solution is to everything, but I do think we need to try and hold our police accountable. And when we get bad service, complain to the appropriate places. It doesn't really help much to complain towards the person who's giving you the bad service. You can do that, of course, but then you really do want to go above to that person's supervisor, the station commissioner, your local politician who covers that ward where that police station is, and try and get more formal complaints, because I think we just are on a point where we just expect the police to be useless, so we don't do anything about it. If a cop tries to bribe us, do we ever contact the corruption line and just say that was so and so, he tried to bribe me? Maybe if they're getting 20 calls about the same person, they might realize, okay, we need to perhaps monitor this person more closely. I don't know. But we do need to try and hold people accountable. I know it's difficult because the police obviously have a power position of authority over us. Some of us might feel, I just don't want to get involved. What could they do to me? Make my life difficult. But then we are allowing bad service, unprofessional service to continue, because we're not placing any consequences for people who actually do that kind of bad service.
Yeah. All right, Gerard. Well, like I say, I think an interesting discussion, just to kind of a lot of the stuff that we've covered in previous episodes of the podcast, but now that you can see our faces, I guess it's nice to kind of just to recontextualize these things for the viewers as we enter into our new era of Tuesday night 8 p.m. live podcasts. And then obviously you can share the link to the show. And please do go, spread the word that Profiler is going to be here live every Tuesday, and then
it remains available.
And then that you can watch or listen anytime after that as well. True Crime Room also with Derek starting now at 9:00 in the next 30 or 40 seconds. So you can jump onto that as well. This is our first hour. We're playing around. We just wanted to put our foot in the water and have and kind of break the ice. We'll be back next week at 8 o'clock with an episode, and we'll be diving into, again, these, just discussing the issues around crime and justice and the criminal justice system in South Africa and the rest of the world. Obviously, we really want you at home to join in with the conversation. So yeah, please jump on the chat. That's going to be a really exciting thing to do as we kind of explore what we can do with this format on this platform and see where it takes us. We really want to try and up our game on the true crime front. I'm also going to get used to pressing the buttons and talking and thinking all at the same time, which is an interesting endeavor. Thank you for your comments, those who joined the chat. Gerard, thanks, man. Maybe we'll wrap up Jan Kempdorp next week. And we'll jump into another case as well.
She's out. She's in society.
Yeah.
See how it goes.
Hopefully she's getting retaining a little bit of counseling here and there, though, and every now and again someone's keeping an eye on what's going on there, because as we discussed, it's not the most common of cases, is it? All right, great, guys. Well, that's been that then. Thank you for tuning into Profiler. Please do hit like if you've been watching we'll be putting out more word that we're doing this now that we kind of, like I say, broken the back of it. Please tell your friends, hit like, please do subscribe. It's so important. We're going to be adding a whole bunch of other stuff into the mix. One thing we'll be able to do is bring some nice rich media into these conversations, clips from interviews we've done with people in the past on various cases, crime scene photographs, all of that kind of stuff. We'll be kind of loading that up as we get better, and you'll be able to, I think, get a really good hour. And of course, pose your questions to the man himself, the profiler, Gerard Labuschagne. It's been great. Thank you, Gerard, for your time.
Thank you, everybody.
And to your fans, thank you for watching. To our fans, thank you for watching. And we'll be back again next week at 8. Jump over and catch True Crime Room with Derek, and tell us what you think. Please comment. Again, like, subscribe, share. That's the plan from here on out, I think. Okay?
Yep.
Cool. Cheers. Thank you, Gerard. Thank you, guys. And we'll see you again next week. Bye-bye.